So they're all there. Let me begin first with Dr. Sanjay Baru, particularly since he will have a good sense of what the message of the book is.
So I think the what I would like to say briefly about the first section of the book, because that is what interests me, are the essays on WTO. And one of the questions that was posed to the panel is on the future of the WTO. I am not such a pessimist. I think there's far too much of multilateral pessimism going around. And somehow the view that if one country, the United States, can turn the clock back, I'm not convinced by that view. I think what has happened in the world in the last decade particularly is that several players have become active who have still a stake in multilateralism. And as long as you have a range of countries, whether it's the European Union itself, China, India, Brazil, the GCC economies, ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, there are a large number of countries who still have a stake in multilateralism. I am not convinced that their stake in multilateralism has been overtaken by the benefits they've been deriving from regional trade blocs or from free trade agreements. I'm not, in fact, convinced that the United States does not require a multilateral system. The US has been flexing its muscles. One should expect the US to do so because it's in many ways on the defensive globally, both on the economic front as well as on the geopolitical front. And as the dominant world power, which it remains, when a dominant world power is on the defensive, it tends to assert its interests in a range of institutions, which is what it is doing. For a long time, it has questioned the relevance of the UN, and our chairman is better suited than any one of us here to comment on that. The US certainly has reduced funding to the UN, but the relevance or irrelevance of the UN is not just because of the United States. I think there are a lot of countries. I mean, for example, in India, I mean, to what extent has the UN served our interests? I'm not convinced that the UN has greatly served our interests. So if there's a global decline in the interest in the UN, that's a different issue. To extend the argument that merely because multilateral institutions like the United Nations, or indeed even the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which are now facing competition from China, merely because their relevance is going down, that of multilateralism and trade is also going to go down, is a proposition I'm not willing to accept, simply because trade is a natural activity of all nations. Every country trades, and trading within some set of rules is better than trading without any rules. The age of mercantilism in that sense is over. The age when trade followed flag and the flag asserted the interests of trade, that age is over. Let me wind up by saying that the view somehow that the 19th century was a century in which the Britain laid down the rules of the game, the 20th century was a century in which the United States laid down the rules of the game, and the 21st century is one in which China will lay down the rules of the game, is a nonsensical view, because it doesn't take into account the fact that both British ability to impose rules as well as American ability was contingent upon their funding of an empire and a global army that maintained their global presence and strategic alliances around the world. China has not yet been able to do that, and I do not see China being able to do that, which is precisely why China works with India, China works with Brazil, China works with Africa, China works with other countries in order to protect its own interests in trade. It is a trading superpower. Its vulnerability is more than almost every other developing countries, because its dependence on the global market is more than the dependence of, let's say, Brazil or India or most of Africa. And to that extent, China requires a multilateral regime to protect its interests. So therefore, I end by saying that multilateralism is not as much under threat as the newspaper headlines suggest, as American writers seem to claim. But on the other hand, there are lots of problems in the functioning of the WTO. The impasse on the Doha round, etc., are genuine challenges to the system, which the organization has to deal with.
Thank you, Sanjay, for that tone of optimism. Mohan, do you share with that tone of optimism?
So, sir, thank you very much for agreeing to chair the session. I cannot imagine anybody better placed than you to do it. I will try to be a little bit more technical, since I have spent close to a decade in Geneva. And for somebody like me who defended India's position very strongly, but also kept in mind that the multilateral forum was really the only name of the game for India. This was, mind you, the 90s, when India got into bilateral agreements very, very reluctantly. I think there were only 3 countries attached to MFN: India, Hong Kong, Japan. Every other country was sleeping with everybody else in the name of FTA. And I think the biggest blunder committed by WTO was to unconditionally and undiscerningly approve every wretched FTA. There were FTAs, as Jagdish Bhagwati, my good friend, would say, there are some FTAs which create trade. They are more trade creations than trade diversionary. But there are some FTAs which were terrible. Unfortunately, WTO decided all FTAs are okay because the European Union started the game, NAFTA started the game, and we couldn't say no to these big guys. So that's one part of the story. I think I completely agree with Sanjaya, and I'm quite stunned by his observation, because he's several things and a guru in some respects, but he's not a WTO expert. And yet he is absolutely right. I mean, forgive me, sir, for saying this about the UN system. If UNIDO is capable of survival, I think any organization is capable of survival. So I do not see the WTO dying. So be very clear about that. He's absolutely spot on. WTO is not going anywhere. It's not dying. But that doesn't mean that for India, there is an existential threat. The problem for India, as I see it, is that we are not very good at the bilateral FTA preferential trade agreement game. We are not good at it. The few agreements that we have entered into with ASEAN, Singapore, Malaysia have been, according to us, an unmitigated disaster. They don't think so. They have happily pocketed the concessions. They want more in RCEP. But that's a different story. For India, it's been bad. At least that's the way we perceive it. You can have views on it. So if bilateral FTA and PTA is not your game, and if all the PTAs or plurilateral trade agreements that are being negotiated in the WTO, India is not part of it. We are not part of the environmental goods negotiations in the WTO. We are not part of the TISA negotiations in the WTO. We are not part of the e-commerce declaration which came out in Argentina. And for God's sake, we are not even part of the investment declaration which came up in in Argentina. So we are not there. And that is the biggest problem for me as far as India is concerned. Because I do not believe, at a time when your chief economic advisor, everybody else is saying we need to grow, our exports need to grow at 15% for the next 10 years. There is no power which has really landed without making 9-10% over 10 years to lift many people out of poverty. How then are you going to assure open and unimpeded markets abroad? That is the challenge for India. So now what can India do? I believe we can do 2 things. And by the way, full disclosure, my book by Palgrave Macmillan, WTO Negotiation Dynamics, is just out as an e-version. And I have given some ideas as to how WTO can be revived. So kindly take a look at that if you are interested and if you get an opportunity. But what could India have done? What can India do? I think the first thing that India needs to do, I agree again with Sanjaya, my good friend, that it's only the United States that is actually treading down this path of unilateralism. Europe is not doing it, China is not doing it. So that's a very profound observation. So I think it is this obsession that whatever US does, the whole world catches a cold, etc., that we are all carried away. There is a trend towards unilateral. There's no trend. There's one country which has decided that, okay, we want to do things differently. So, what does India do? I think the first thing that needs to be fixed is the dispute settlement mechanism. There is a profound crisis afflicting the dispute settlement mechanism. We decided after much discussion and in the Uruguay round that we don't want the previous GATT dispute settlement mechanism because that was pick and choose. If United States lost a dispute in the GATT, they would object to it and the report would not be accepted. If Europe lost the dispute, they would say, we don't like it, don't accept it. We thought this is absurd. If you don't ask a murderer who lost a case in the Supreme Court, would you like to accept the verdict of the Supreme Court, or a rapist? So we followed the same rule in the Uruguay round and said everybody else will decide except the parties to the conflict. And that is why you had the jewel in the crown as part of the Uruguay round, which was the dispute settlement mechanism, which has worked wonderfully. I mean, what other system, I ask you, including the International Criminal Court, whatever conflict resolution model you have, I now teach conflict resolution. This is the best system. Which other system could have conceived of St. Lucia winning against the mighty United States? The only system that could allow this was the WTO system. What I think the US is doing, in terms of negotiations, the WTO can take care of itself and others can live with it. I think the USA's worst and most unkind cut is what they have done in terms of blocking the appointments to the appellate body. Because the appellate body is 7 wise men and women, and whatever they say is the last word on the subject. And because of the dispute settlement rule in the WTO, these findings are enforceable and binding. You have no choice. You have to accept the finding. You either compensate your trading partners or you accept trade retaliation. If you knock the bottom out of this system, then WTO loses all meaning. I might as well negotiate in UNCTAD. Why would I go to WTO? I would go negotiate intellectual property rights in WIPO. The only reason we all negotiated in the WTO was because of the dispute settlement mechanism. Every law that is enacted, negotiated, is enforceable. It's not like the resolution on Palestine, which can go on for 45 years in the UN system. That's what we WTO guys used to say about the UN, somewhat disparagingly. But if WTO now says, after Doha, and I left WTO in 2001 after launching the Doha, where we thought we had made huge compromises to get this new round going, and then to find that nothing much has happened in the WTO is, I think, for 2 reasons. One, I think the Western countries basically felt if in the Uruguay round we could get away with murder, we can get away with murder every time. That didn't happen. Because there are countries like China and India which now don't just drop dead and roll over. You basically say no. So that is one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that even smaller countries now have realized that what matters, what happens in the WTO matters to them existentially. So they have started taking more interest, countries which had 1 or 2 diplomats running between UNCTAD, WIPO and WTO now have full-fledged missions, which now take a lot of interest in what happens in the WTO. So by definition, negotiations have become much more difficult. But I think the major problem is that the developing countries think that the imbalances of the Uruguay round and the heavy concessions made by India have somehow got to be compensated by developed countries in the future. The developed countries basically think that negotiation is dead and gone. We have pocketed what we have pocketed. Let's start a fresh round and a fresh give and take. That's the real problem, frankly. That is the real problem, because we see it as a continuum, several developing countries. They do not see it as a continuum. And that is the reason why basically they're asking for really the setting aside of the Doha round and then move on to something else. So coming back to my prescription, because there are other panelists who need to speak, and I'm happy to interact later if there are questions from the audience. The first thing that needs to be done, I think India, if it can get together with EU and some other like-minded, it cannot be the non-aligned kind of countries or a G77. That will not work in the WTO context. But I think the India, EU, ASEAN, Brazil, Australia, China. This, I think, is a necessary kind of quorum. And all these countries will stand by dispute settlement mechanism. And it needs to be made more effective, or at least you go back to status quo ante. I think that can be done. What does US want? US wants a complete cast iron affirmation that the dispute settlement mechanism will not add to the rights and obligations in terms of its judgments. That is something the appellate body has done. In a couple of judgments, the appellate body has filled in the negotiating vacuum, especially in anti-dumping, where there is a technique called zeroing in anti-dumping. I don't want to get into details. The appellate body has therefore created law. So it's interesting, all the comments made by United States about the dispute settlement mechanism today was all done by India in 1990. We used to say exactly the same thing, by the way. We didn't matter at the time, so nobody cared. But US obviously matters. So we used to say the same thing about the dispute settlement mechanism. So I think if the General Council, upon, shall we say, prompting by India, EU, Brazil, etc., if we can make a statement to the appellate body and the dispute settlement panel, number one, don't create new obligations, not for United States, not for India, not for anybody else. Only deal with the issue in front of you. The appellate body has got this bad habit of, going all over the place, making judgments which are, obiter dicta. So you have that problem. Those of you who are knowledgeable about WTO will know what we are talking about, So that is something we need to avoid. And lastly, just make sure that the appellate body reports and the panel reports are reduced dramatically in size. There has been this unfortunate tendency in the WTO to have a 400-page report. I have participated in 5 panels, dispute settlement panels in the WTO, and 400 pages, nobody reads it. You read the executive summary. So I think something needs to be done to simplify issues, make the plaintiff's arguments clear, the complainant's argument clear, and you say this is what the panel thinks according to the law. That's it. It shouldn't take more than 10, 15 pages. I don't know why this is so complicated. So I think if this can be done, there is half a chance that Mr. Robert Lighthizer can be convinced that, listen, henceforth, you will not have this problem with the WTO dispute settlement mechanism when it comes to judgments in the US. On the other hand, the US must be told that you cannot then say that if you lose a case, you will not accept it, but if you win a case, it's fine. The biggest silver lining in the cloud that I see with regard to the dispute settlement mechanism is that the United States, in taking 3 actions against China recently, has nevertheless chosen to go to the WTO on intellectual property rights. I think that's a very, very positive development. They haven't lost faith entirely. On Section 301 actions against China, there is a part of it where they have chosen to go to the WTO dispute settlement mechanism and say, we are contesting China's actions under the TRIPS agreement. That's a good sign. I think one should use that to tell the US, you are not going to get an appellate body judgment if there aren't enough judges. Incidentally, it's an Indian who's now heading the appellate body bench, Ujjal Singh Bhatia, who is a former Indian ambassador to GATT and WTO. So I think there is half a chance there. But for that, I think you need to mobilize action. I also have to frankly say, I'm speaking under Chatham House rules, I'm still not off the cooling off period. It's 1 year before government servants can speak very freely. I'm still 9 months, so don't get me into trouble. But jokes aside, I think one other thing I think that needs to be borne in mind is basically that if you can, India has a problem with the United States on the trade front. Otherwise, I would have said India alone can do this. We are very well placed in the WTO to do this kind of thing, to create a consensus on dispute settlement. But we have a problem with the United. I think while the strategic and defense relationship with the United States is moving ahead very, very rapidly, we have a problem when it comes to intellectual property rights, and the trade subject, or the trade dossier with US is a problem, which is why I think an alliance between India, EU, and EU, especially Germany, France, UK, who I think are on the same wavelength. I think there needs to be friends of DSU created by India. I think India can do this. The second thing that needs to be done from India's perspective is, very frankly, I have not understood why we are objecting to negotiations in investment. It's hard. It is one thing for India to say that we will object vehemently to labor standards being included in the WTO. It's one thing for India to say environmental standards should not be included. That's fine. Our CEP does not have these two, so we are okay with it. although we're having trouble, but we are okay. At least the subjects are okay. E-commerce poses certain problems to us if you're interested in net neutrality and if you're interested in issues like data exclusivity. But I still think it's much better for India to discuss these issues within the tent than outside the tent. And you know, I feel bad as a negotiator because sometimes I get the feeling that the country thinks we have done a very bad job. I don't think so. I actually think that in intellectual property rights, most of the damage happened for India when India walked out of the Uruguay round. It was that 1.5 years when India did not participate in the intellectual property negotiations in the Uruguay round that the maximum damage happened. Indian negotiators obviously are intensely hated by their other counterparts. That's fine. You're not in a beauty contest. You don't have to be loved. But I don't think you can say, anybody can say that Indian negotiators have let the country down. We've done a wonderful job, actually, both in Uruguay round and in Doha. You make the best of a bad job. But that's what we have done. So I'm not able to understand what this negotiating pessimism is all about. That I can't understand. I can understand that you should not accept subjects which are completely alien to the trading system. But I think investment, e-commerce, we can handle it. We were not born yesterday. We have now a good body of diplomats who know WTO. It was not like the 90s when there were 3 people out of a country of 1 billion people who were experts on WTO. That was ridiculous. But now I think you have a much, much larger number. You have alliances. Your positions are very similar to others in Africa. So I don't think we are in that much of a bad position. So taking off from where Sanjay left, and I will finish, sir, Mr. Chairman, with your permission. I do believe the WTO is in the ICU, but it will not die. What will happen, though, is one of 2 things. The WTO can play the waiting game. Wait, and to put it very bluntly, wait for a regime change in one particular country. You know which country I'm talking about. So you can do that. There are organizations which can wait it out, or they can basically say, let's go plurilateral, bilateral, and then when a TPP does get done, it will be the most modern trade agreement. They will bring it right back to the WTO. And that is what worries me just a little bit as far as India is concerned. Because this was the same story in the Uruguay round. You know, I think more than anything else in the WTO, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. And this is exactly what happened to countries like India. They had actually knocked every other country on the head, made it accept the intellectual property rights, and we were left alone. That's what they will do. And other countries will initially start by agreeing with India, and then as time goes by, they will take care of their interests and desert us. We are used to that also, by the way. That's not a problem again for Indian negotiators. Eklo chalo has never been a problem. We are quite happy to do that. But I think for India, the time is therefore a judgment call. How badly do you need a multilateral trading system based on MFN? It is as simple as that. Are you okay with a range of bilateral agreements whereby your exports alone will happen at a much higher MFN rate and everybody else will export to the same attractive markets at 1 or 2% less than the MFN? If you can live with it, you do what you're doing now, which is treat the whole thing, let it take its course. But if you don't, and I think we can't afford to wait, in which case I think we need to now take proactive action to make sure the multilateral trading system is revived before it is too late. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much once again.
Well, I can clearly see that Mohan did the best of a bad job when he was working. You know, Mohan, multilateralism originated way in the 40s with the U.S. desire for the containment of communism. That was the origin of the multilateral system. So what you and Sanjay are recommending, that in China, India, ASEAN, Brazil, South Africa, EU get together, it sounds to me that the policy we need now is the containment of the US. That's the strategy that you're advocating, that what the world needs now is containment of the US. Okay, let me turn to Mr. Mustafizur Rahman and look forward to what he has to say on this.
Thank you, Chair. It's really a privilege and an honor to be speaking on this panel with so many eminent speakers, and particularly yourself being the chair. But first of all, let me register my deep appreciation of the lifetime work of my senior friend Pradeep. We have always been looking up to him since we were young in the 1990s, and Pradeep was our guru. And we had many street fighting days, and we have always looked up to him in the context of the issues that Bangladesh and other LDCs were flagging in the context of WTO negotiations. So this is an opportunity to say thank you to Pradeep for everything that he has done. And in fact, he was one of the very first persons who really got ourselves interested that when we talk about multilateralism or trade, at the end of the day, it is the people, is the consumers, and that little person in a little corner who is not represented in the negotiating table, his or her interest has to be taken into account and kept in mind. I think for that we are very grateful to Pradeep. Now the theme of today's discussion is very important in the context of what is happening in multilateral trade-related arena. And my two eminent predecessors, the panelists have. Well, before I was coming to this panel, I was not sure what will be the vibe of the panel, because and then when I heard both of them, I'm really encouraged that we are on the same page. That it is still premature to say that WTO is dead. Maybe it is in coma, but we can still revive it. I think that is something that and I really appreciate my two predecessors have emphasized on that. Coming from an LDC such as Bangladesh, we always have appreciated WTO in the sense that for the weaker nations, a rule-based multilateral system is maybe not the best, but it is best amongst the possible scenarios that one can think of. My own country, Bangladesh, has benefited tremendously from being member of the WTO. I think we have friends from Nepal here as well. We have made very good use of the duty-free, quota-free market access, which is provided and endorsed in the WTO for the LDCs. And now, as we go forward, for example, Bangladesh is making two graduations. One graduation, we will be out of the LDC group by 2024. We have already been accepted for eligibility in 2018. And so after two triennial reviews, Bangladesh will be out of the LDC group in 2024. So will be Nepal. So will be half of the current 34 WTO LDC members. So I think that we are passing through a very important juncture. That the duty-free, quota-free, and other special and differential treatment that we are getting as part of the WTO. Pharmaceuticals, you don't have to buy the patent and license, and there is also services waiver negotiations. So the whole scenario is changing. It's becoming more challenging. Then also we have, for example, Bangladesh has also made a second graduation. In 2015, we became from low-income country to lower middle-income country, which means that we are now not eligible for the for the concessional loan only. It is just blended finance. So all these double graduation is really very important in the context of Bangladesh to look at the WTO as an opportunity in going forward in a rule-based system. So this is I think very important. I am also I would also like to reiterate what Mr. Mohan said is that whilst yes, USA has the unilateral steps that it is taking, and China reciprocating in the same way, but they have not abandoned the WTO system, the DSB system. Yes, they are obstructing the appointment of the three panelists, and by maybe end of 2019, the whole WTO dispute settlement body, as was very rightly mentioned, the jewel in the crown in the WTO, might become fully paralyzed. But I'm hopeful that USA will also understand that if it is quid pro quo and outside of the WTO, it will do more harm to the USA as well. So I think that USA has some points, and we'll have to take those into cognizance. We'll have to have a multilateral trading system ready for 21st century. And what is also very important is that we are, in one way, we are also accepting that the WTO has to change. I remember in 1996 when the 4 Singapore issues came, and we were vehemently against, and our senior colleagues over here, they will be remembering the trade facilitation, investment, government procurement, competition policy. Then trade facilitation came back to the WTO, and we have accepted, and the trade facilitation agreement was there, but with various special and differential provisions for countries like ourselves. So I think that TFA also gives us some cue with regard to some of the other contentious issues, and it was mentioned about the investment policy. I saw that Mr. Suresh Prabhu mentioned that India is not per se against investment, but it has to be not about protection, but about trade facilitation. I think that was the point that he made. And we are really encouraged by the March meeting which was convened in New Delhi, and many countries came, more than 50 countries came, China and the USA were also there. So although there was no declaration, it was not supposed to be also coming out with a declaration, but we are very encouraged that not everything is lost, that countries are being engaged in the process. So what for us is very important is that the Doha development round and the ethos of the Doha development, the developmental content of the Doha development, I think that should be the way for us to look forward, because in 2001, that is what really brought us all together, and in spite of the fact that we didn't have in Buenos Aires, we couldn't come up with the ministerial declaration, but there were decisions with regard to, it was mentioned, e-commerce and fisheries subsidies, and these are the issues that we can take forward. With regard to the systemic issues, I think it was mentioned by Mr. Mohan that yes, plurilaterals are now becoming, a sort of way of life in the context of the WTO, some of the WTO members, and we will have to craft our stance with regard to whether we remain outside of the plurilaterals or we say that we engage there, and if something the plurilaterals are agreed, you multilateralize it. And there is a special and differential treatment for developing and LDC countries. So I think that the systemic issues will also have to be, maybe we will have to have a new stance with regard to how the decision making in the WTO is taking place. I think that the single undertaking is coming under pressure. The consensus-based decision-making is coming under pressure, but we will have to also, accommodate some of the concerns that we are not being able to come up with consensus-based decisions. So I think this is very important for us to keep in mind. I think going forward, we see that. Even those countries which were against e-commerce in Buenos Aires, we are seeing that they are also being engaged in the discussions. Investment, as I said, some of the countries are coming back and said, why not discuss some of the issues if it is trade related. So I think that there is also amongst the members a consensus is growing up that we will have to remain engaged, although there are a lot of problems which we are seeing. And obviously for us, at the same time, the other routes also are important, bilateral and regional routes. Bangladesh is one of the very few countries which doesn't have a bilateral free trade agreement. So we are also now thinking about bilateral free trade agreement with some of the countries, particularly Sri Lanka. We are making advance, and India has also given a proposal for bilateral free trade agreement, but it has to be more comprehensive economic partnership type of agreement rather than just trade type of agreement. So I think all routes matter for us. Multilateral route is one, it is very important, but at the same time we will also explore the other routes, regional routes and bilateral routes. So and WTO is not the only player on the block. So I would like to submit that for us a rule-based system is something that we will continue to support, and as we graduate out of the LDCs, obviously within the WTO also the coalition building will be changing. For example, beyond 2024 we will not be within the LDC group. We will have to then make issue-specific coalitions with other countries, and I would have been happy if it was mentioned that India will be negotiating with the EU and others. But I think that that LDCs will also be a very important block. You see, half of the LDCs will be graduating beyond 2024. So that will also be a major force within the WTO. And one will also have to remember that one of our demands within the WTO is that how do you help, how does multilateral system help the LDCs which have graduated to make graduation sustainable? That is also very, very important. In fact, in 2005, there was a decision that the multilateral system and the WTO members will help graduated LDCs. And that's when the European Union came with the proposal that even if the LDCs graduate finally, they will provide duty-free, quota-free under the everything but arms, the EBA, for another 3 years. So, for example, if Bangladesh graduates finally out in 2024, we will get the duty-free, quota-free from the European Union till 2027. So these are also the issues which we have an interest, even if we graduate within the WTO system. So I would like to submit that we will be there if India obviously is a major player in the WTO, and I think that the LDCs have a common interest with India in making the multilateral system work. So please count European Union and Brazil, but also count the LDCs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In many ways, what we have just heard is something that I certainly saw a lot of when I was in the UN, which is that ultimately the people who care, for whom multilateralism is most important, are what I would describe as the global SMEs, small and medium economies. And they are the ones who need it much more. The big guys can always look after themselves, you see. But it's these people who have, and in some ways the role that the UN has played is in providing a space where SMEs, the new people who have come up and become big, China, India, etc., and the old powers can talk with one another. And many of the coalitions that have been built, which have worked in the more operational forums like WTO, had their origin there. But we'll come back to all that much later. Shakti, all yours.
Historically, we are told that there have been 3 phases in the recent, 1870s to the First World War was the first, not the First World War, going on to 1929 in the Depression and the crash, and Smoot-Hawley was the first phase. Then 1945, USA pushed up to, say, the second oil crisis of 1973. And then, of course, stagflation in Europe, etc. And then again from the 80s till a date we don't know, maybe 2008, we don't know when. We feel that this process under severe challenge. So it's not something that is really new to us. But historically, India has been an extremely open economy. In the 60s, 70s, we were told these are smugglers. They're not smugglers, they are free traders. They've always traded with Africa, West Asia, for thousands of years. Now we brought in a legality and had made them smugglers. Fortunately, Dr. Manmohan Singh in 91 realized it, and we are back to being normal again. Romans were complaining about trade deficit with India in the 50 BC. In 17th century, Russia and Kazan sable was being quoted in ruble and the Indian currency. So India has been traditionally a very heavily globalized economy all the time. 18th century, I've done a bit of work on it, was actually a period when India's globalization was reaching its peak, where we had new kingdoms which have come up, and they were doing what the World Bank now calls the ease of doing business. They were attracting businesses to their area so that their revenues could go up. And India was massively networked. But we have forgotten all that now. The Raj, of course, came in the way, made imports cheaper, exports impossible. And then, of course, things changed. The point I'm trying to make is that while historically we have been very, very open, because of our colonial experience, particularly the 30s onwards, the depression, the shortages, the war shortages, inflation, need to controls, and the economic path we adopted, today we can criticize it, then it was considered to be the right thing to do. Good people from Raul Prebish to Gunnar Middle telling us what to do. We took at that path where we were and ultimately it was the use of the USA unilaterally of special 301 and Super 301, if I remember correctly, Pradeep, right? And we abuse the USA for threatening us all the time with action, you know? How dare they make us? And therefore, Mohan, I'll disagree with a bit on the FTA bit. We are not the best of FTA trading partners, negotiators. We actually don't offer anything. We really don't offer anything out of the way. Agriculture is a no-go for us. And therefore, I can't see how you and Brazil and Australia can team up together. Australia and Brazil want low tariffs for agriculture. We want the highest possible tariffs for agriculture. So why would they talk with you to form a group? So we have major issues. I'm not saying we are villains. I'm merely saying is that it's not easy for India to be really trying to show the way. Even now, we maintain a massive gap between our applied rates and our bound rates. And therefore, we are happy to hike up the tariff, saying, no, we are still within the bound rate, so you can't tell I'm protectionist, which is legally correct. But the world of trade is not legal. The world of trade is political. You must remember it is very political. And it is not just the politicians who say so. In fact, if you go back, Hector Olin, immediately it was overturned by Stopler Samuelson, saying, yes, in the country with higher wages, there would be job losses. This Samuelson and Stopler told us this in the early 50s. It is not that people are not aware of it. There are costs to be paid for trade, which must be addressed upfront instead of pretending it does not exist. Too long we have pretended it does not exist. So instead of preparing the people for the next level of jobs, we think they'll handle themselves. And that allows the scaremongers to then take over and go to the other extreme. Scaremongers are wrong, absolutely. But they are there, and therefore, how does one move ahead? We are this thing about our trade deficit with China, right? We get very upset about it. Go to Bangladesh, they will tell you trade deficit with India is very big. Go to Nepal, they say trade deficit in India is very big. USA tells us your trade deficit, So bilaterally, when you look at it, obviously it is political. It's not right. Bangladesh needs a trade deficit with India. And as I told my Nepalese friend all the time, yes, 70% of your imports are from India, but 70% of exports are also to India. How much more can you go above 70, right? That is because the moment it is political, but we don't address the political point, then easy to then misuse the arguments, which all of us do all the time. I think it is there that we need to understand it. Difficult to, after Clinton won the 92 elections on NAFTA alone. Mr. Perot got the votes because he says that NAFTA is a large sucking sound, a vacuum cleaner sucking out jobs from the USA. George Bush lost the election. Clinton becomes president. 2000, more or less the same thing happens when Gore loses despite the fiasco at Seattle, which was an engineered fiasco at Seattle, because Democrats felt any trade liberalization means losing the elections. So trade has been a dirty word in the developed world also for a very long time. Ultimately, what does Obama do in 2008? Look inward, forget the world. So we have to address this very, very solidly. We've tried our best through multilateral, has not worked, plurilateral, bilateral, to the extent that most countries spend more time negotiating than actually attaining anything. Because we actually lack the capacities to carry on these detailed negotiations. How long is our negotiation with the EU going on? For how many years? 20 years? 15 years at least? At least 15 years we're talking to the EU, and we are stuck on cars and we're stuck on wine. EU wants low tariffs on cars, which we don't want. EU wants low tariffs on wine, which we won't agree to, right? So it's taken, because how do you negotiate with the EU? You think you're talking to one guy, but that one guy talking to 28 guys, right? So we lack the capacity. So I think we'll have to accept the fact that trade pessimism will stay with us. What do we do instead? WTO is fine, fight your WTO battles, get your dispute panel. I'm happy Vijay Singh Bhatia, my former colleague in the Commerce Ministry, is now the chairman of this thing. Keep doing all that, but unless you improve your own domestic economic growth and create jobs within the economy, which makes imports that much more attractive to you. But what do we tell everybody? Even today, we tell everybody exports are good, imports are bad. We start with the assumption that imports are bad. And I have to tell people, yeah, so buying food is bad, right? Because that's your imports in the house. Why are you buying food? Why are you buying clothes? But this is a point that we have hammered into our system, and therefore it won't go away very, very easily. So I think we'll have to live with this Damocles sword over WTO and globalization. But as I said, it's not something that we really worry about, be paralyzed by it, but learn to accept the political reality of it and then try to work incrementally at different fronts at the same time. Thank you very much.
So what you're saying is mercantilism never disappears all that quickly. It remains there, however much people may talk the trade liberalization. Pradeep, why don't you comment?
Let me just respond to a few important points which I think are important for the future. One is, as he rightly pointed out, Mohan, there is a silver lining in the cloud insofar as the dispute settlement system is concerned. The US has filed not just a dispute against China, but also a dispute against India for our agricultural subsidies. So the US is today, the administration in US is totally berserk. Nobody knows what is happening. I mean, every other day a new person is being appointed, somebody is being sacked. And there are a lot of things which we knew that ultimately Trump is going to come around to more sanity than what he would like to exhibit. Now what he has done and what we are afraid about the US is he's appointed hawks. Good sane people have left his administration in the cabinet, and that is what our fear is. Lighthizer is a hawk. I mean, he believes that we are all bleeding multilateralists, for example. So I mean, we do have these problems, but I'm sure. But the point is about the dispute settlement system. They have finally woken up to the appointment of appellate body members. They have responded. So far, they were totally quiet. They were not even acknowledging the note from the WTO Secretariat that look, the appellate body is so many members are going. So their response only shows that things are going to change. And I'm also an optimist the way Sanjay or Mohan or all of us are. And I think Mustafizur raised some very important points. As we go in future, one is that variable geometry is going to be a part of the game. So single undertaking is out, and if we continue to insist on single undertaking, we are going to be foolish. And by the way, Mohan, now investment, it has been bandied about by people without understanding as to what is the issue under discussion at the WTO. They are talking about investment facilitation. They are not talking about investment policy, which has been thrown out long ago. Our fear is, and rightfully, that look, this might be an entry point for investment policy at a later stage. Now, 1 minute. We ourselves have been a demander, and a very poorly articulated demand on services facilitation in terms of Mode 4, movement of natural persons. We were so hopeless, and every time we spoke to the Commerce Ministry, which is now consisting of bureaucrats who haven't got half the capability that we had in the past, to be very honest. And this is Chatham's rules, don't quote me. But it's a tragedy. I mean, I'm expressing it as a citizen of India. That today, services facilitation, we moved a proposal. Finally, India was a demander for something. Otherwise, we are always a reactor. We always reactive. We are never sort of demanding for something. And this is a long history. But anyway, I'm going to write about it one day. I don't know what, after reading Mohan, come out with another copy about how India is negotiating. Thinking has been, this has been totally pathetic. Now, so on e-commerce, and very rightly you said we have to get inside the tent. Suresh Prabhu has understood that. And one of the pieces of advice that he's taken from me, right? I said, look, we cannot remain outside. Now the problem was, and this is a genuine problem with Shakti, which you referred to in a very fleeting manner. The domestic economy. We require domestic economic reforms. The agriculture subsidies which US has challenged in the WTO against India is a part of our very weak system. Including, every time we go to the industry, and we work with the industry also quite closely, CII and FICCI, etc. They often speak about the fact is that they're so disadvantaged as compared to any other manufacturer in Bangladesh, for example. They've done very sound study to show that we are 17% disadvantage in our cost of manufacture. So how can we compete? Electricity, interest, etc. Only the other day, Rakesh Bharti Mittal, president of CII, spoke about reducing the interest rate, for example. So the Indian industry is certainly disadvantaged. And whenever we have entered into FTAs we entered into, and that was Dr. Manmohan Singh's thinking actually. He sacked Kamal Nath and put Anand Sharma as the Minister for Commerce. At that point of time, his thinking was that unless you bring in pressure through these trade agreements, our industry will never change. Why do you think China entered the WTO? To only lock in domestic reforms. Otherwise, they would never have been able to do it. And that was Dr. Manmohan Singh's thinking. Now, it did not work out the way it should have worked out. Even at that point of time, nobody realized that there was a discussion on investment policy. Only Dr. Manmohan Singh said, why are we afraid about negotiating investment policy? I still remember in 1 year when Tata bought Chorus in UK, we were net exporters of FDI. India was a net exporter of capital, FDI from India. So we are a big foreign FDI exporter. So we have interest. We have interest in a small country like Maldives. Cancel a contract of GMR on the airport, if you remember. And ultimately they got it through. Got it through arbitration, which was there. But just to give you an example, that Indian investment is also vulnerable. And therefore, an investment policy per se is not going to be harmful to us. But fair enough. We are afraid that, and incidentally, US is not interested in investment policy. They want a very high standard agreement. You know what the high standard agreement is? That we want national treatment pre-entry. We say that national treatment can only be given post-entry, once we allowed you to come in. They say, no, we want it pre-entry. And that could be one contentious issue between India and US, the day we go for an FTA, anything. See, we should have a right to enter. And that is you leave. So that is the kind of high standard agreement which the US wants in the WTO, which so therefore it has never moved forward. Today, investment facilitation is ease of doing business. The single window, etc. So all these issues will be there. And as rightly pointed out by the panelists, we cannot afford to remain outside the negotiating, outside the discussion room. It is still discussions, it is not negotiations. It could lead to negotiations, it will lead to negotiations in one way or the other, but there's no harm. It would be more harmful if you stayed out and then you were not able to influence. As Mohan recalled the history of TRIPS, that for 1.5 years you stayed out and it got bugged. The whole agreement has turned out to be. TRIPS is the most anathematical agreement in the WTO rubric in its whole acquis. It's the only agreement with people like Jagdish Bhagwati, my guru, T.N. Srinivasan, call it toxic. It has no business to be there. It's a restriction, trade restriction. What is intellectual property got to do with trade? And how cleverly it was brought into the Uruguayan is also very interesting. It was brought in as counterfeit goods. Counterfeit goods, they're bad. Who wants to sell, duplicate goods and spurious goods, etc. Yeah, we can discuss that in the WTO. And slowly that, started expanding in all possible directions. But that said, we have a serious problem in our domestic economy. The other problem is, and many of you are from outside India may not know, but we are a quasi-federal country. We are neither federal nor unitary. We are a very peculiar country in the sense that, even legislation, policy making is so complex here. And all the action has to take place at the level of states. Would you imagine not a single state government, in spite of all our efforts all this while, has a WTO cell? They are not interested in external trade except for bordering states like West Bengal or Tripura or Rajasthan and Punjab, who, because of international trade with the neighboring country. That's the only possible understanding that they have, Shakti. Otherwise, none of the state governments there is any understanding or any interest in terms of international trade. Export, yes. Somebody said, so as Shakti rightly said, exports are good, imports are bad, which is terrible. Without imports, you cannot export. Without imports, you cannot, I mean, the whole idea of consumer welfare is that you have to import in cases that, you know, if I can buy a mobile phone for 8,000 rupees, why should I pay 1 lakh rupees for it? For example. There is a consumer welfare aspect also, which also deals with your own economy in a sense. But the domestic economic reforms, as I said, was in a quasi-federal country with, you know, with very sort of volatile politics as we see even today. It's so difficult to move, and states are not yet fully geared. They are happy to get incentives to set up export parks and, you know, do all those kind of things. That's all with their understanding of what international trade is. Shakti, their understanding of international trade, even a state like Delhi, is zero. Absolutely zero. There is no understanding at all. And therefore, they are not able to, you know, contribute to policy making at the center, and therefore it is entirely a central issue. Fair enough. I mean, in the sense that central government, the union government has to negotiate and do everything, and not the state government. But implementation has to happen at the grassroots, over which center has really no control, no command, except for some policies which they can, you know, tweak in terms of center. Then, having said that, I think Musavizo made a very important point in terms of, you know, if half of the 34 LDC WTO members are going to graduate, it's going to create another issue in the WTO. How are you going to deal with this? But Musavizo, if you remember, when the agreement on textiles and clothing was exhausting, Bangladesh led a group of countries, though it must continue. And today Bangladesh is a bigger garment exporter than us. So here's a good example to show that, you know, you don't need those concessions. If you have the right kind of will and desire and spirit, you can do it. And as I said, why can't Nepalese think of becoming Switzerland? No, seriously, I'm not joking. I'm not joking, because you're not thinking. You're only thinking that you know, this big brother India is going to swallow you. India is not interested. You've got our own problems. But so you have to think, you know, and envision the possibility. No, today many times we do South Asia events, inviting Pakistanis. We do it in Kathmandu. We can't do it in India. You know, it's always so difficult here. Why can't you take advantage of your location, including your neutrality or whatever? Thank you, sir.
We can encroach a little into our drinking time. So may I invite any questions, comments that people have particularly? Yes, please.
Director of the Department of Trade, Minister of Commerce of Myanmar. So I have some question to Mr. Mohan Kumar. So before I ask the question, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to all distinguished panelists for your very insightful and very fruitful discussion. So of course, Mr. Mohan Kumar, you are rightly found out that India negotiators are very tough, because I also witnessed how tough they are while the TFA negotiation during the 2013, and of course, another thing is, you know, the thing is, developing country, they do no longer want DDA negotiation, as you know, and they are now putting the new issue like the e-commerce, also the investment facilitations, also MISME, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. So I just want to know the Indian position, or how the revitalization of the DDA negotiation, or is there any expectation to get some benefit out of those DDA negotiation, or what is your view on this, because the developing country, they no longer want, they don't want any wording to strengthen the DDA negotiation in various sides, also in the, you know, Kenya in Nairobi. They didn't want to revitalize the DDA negotiations. So I want to know your view on those kind of DDA negotiations and any expectation from this negotiation. This is the another one thing is that regarding the new issue. You also point out that some of the India view how you can deal with this, for example, e-commerce and all those things. So as you mentioned, some country they just want to wait and see, and some country they want to go and see because they want to discuss and they want to engage in the negotiation or discussion or how they can benefit out of those new issue negotiations. And what is the India view? An Indian position for this new issue. So could you please answer for this question? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can we take one or two more questions? Yes. Can we pass this? Let's take about 2 or 3 questions and then we can.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my respect to all dignitaries and learned person in the dais, in the panel. I also take this opportunity to express my high regards to Pradeep ji on this occasion. He has been eastern supporter of consumer welfare in the region, and I had the opportunity to work with as a member of South Asian Works on Trade, Economics and Environment on developing, on advising government of Nepal the competition, framing the competition policy within there. Of course, I have one questions and my observation. I am sometimes I think that I am in the false notion that WTO is a very democratic institution. I thought like that because in the UN systems you have the veto power of the big 5 countries, but WTO every nation has the equal right. But in practice, if some other poor countries or smaller country, they can never block any proposal in WTO. We have seen that. But United States has blocked it. So what is I think they should have given some reasons behind it, the rationale behind the blocking of the appointment of the appellate judges. So what are their rationales and what is their logic and how they have become, because all the countries, rest of the countries, as I understand that they are in favor of having the judges in place in appellate body in WTO. This is the only country, United States, is blocking it. So what is the reason and what is the rationale behind it? And now we understand that WTO is also largely dominated by the big powers. And the thing that every nation has the equal right and equal opportunity, that is just a false notion. Am I right? Just I ask this question to Ambassador Kumar.
One more question.
Hi, this is a question for Mr. Mohan Kumar. I take a slight exception.
Where are you from? Sorry.
I'm Animesh. I'm from Moody's.
From?
Moody's.
Yeah.
I take a slight exception to the statement you said that it's about regime change. We can wait about regime change in the US. But if you look at the political currents in the US, also in places in Europe, whether you look at the Democratic Party, if you look at all the future candidates of the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, front runners, there is a very clear shift towards left in the US, towards protectionism. So I don't think it's just about one guy. If you can get rid of this guy, and then protectionism will go away. And the same currents are there in places like Germany, in France, from both the left and the right in France, and the rise of Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, in the UK with Brexit. So I don't think that it is a one-off thing. It can probably go on longer. And just to address that, how would India react to, any policy front if this protectionism is a longer thing, not just about one man? Lastly, most of it, I think, is this political undercurrent is coming because of wage stagnation in these Western countries. So it is not about trade, it's mostly about wage stagnation, which is pushing this kind of thing there. Thank you.
Okay, Mohan.
Thank you very much. I am now regretting I am an expert on WTO, but anyway. You'll have to bear the cross. So, a friend from Myanmar, the Doha Development Agenda and the new issues. So the official Government of India's view, if you want, I can give it. But if you want my personal view, I now have the liberty of having retired, so I can be a little bit more candid. The government view is very clear. We are absolutely committed to the Doha development agenda, and we do not want extraneous new issues to overload the agenda. So that's the Government of India's view. Got it? You don't want my personal view, right? No, I'm asking. So if you want my personal view, I have a view which is slightly controversial, but it's in my book, so I can't even disown it anymore. I feel that since the Western countries have picked on one of the sustainable development goals, dealing with life under the ocean, and have launched fishery subsidies negotiations, in my book I have mentioned that we should perhaps have a new round, call it the SDG round, and then link it to SDG. So you have an SDG, no poverty, no hunger. So that should take care of agriculture negotiations. It should take care of the public stockholding problem that India has. That's one. If you want to have, for example, net connectivity for everybody, that is one of the SDGs, that, you know, connectivity and so on should be for everybody. I think link it to the services agreement and try to define e-commerce in that context. So that's one thing you can do. I then go on to talk of other things where I think we are talking about electricity. For example, photovoltaic cells subsidies. The WTO has no business interfering in this because it is, I mean, the climate change agreement for me clearly trumps the trade agreement. So what I'm trying to say in my book is that SDGs are a much higher objective than just the mercantilist objective of a trade agreement. Now, how tough this is going to be for the US to accept, I don't know. Many Western countries may not agree, but they are the ones who picked up this SDG on fishery subsidies. I do not see why India should not pick up on other SDGs, which are actually much more important for India than saving fish. I mean, to save human lives, I imagine, is much more important than saving fish, right? So I think those SDGs are extremely critical. So I've talked about an SDG round. The problem, political problem that this poses, which I'm also aware of, is that now kind of disengaging from the Doha round has become very difficult for India because we invested so much. By the way, I must also tell you, it's curious that having been part of the Doha round, and then I left the WTO, the Indian Parliament tore us and told us that, ripped us apart and told us that we had sold out. That's also true, huh? So it's not as if we were in love with Doha round when it happened. We are now in now in love with Doha round. So times also change. But that is my answer as far as, and as far as the new issues are concerned, you heard me. I really think investment and e-commerce, we are better within the tent than outside it. Now, my friend from Nepal, I don't want to really bore the audience with highly technical details, but the US rationale on the dispute settlement mechanism is not irrational. Their objections to several other things in the WTO can be described as irrational. The dispute settlement mechanism, what they are saying, is actually based, from their point of view, it is logical. I mean, the dispute settlement mechanism cannot create law in the WTO. They are only supposed to interpret law, which has already been negotiated by members of the WTO. But I can give you examples where the appellate body, I think, has gone just over the line. And one of them I mentioned is the zeroing technique used only by the United States on anti-dumping. We all knew that, but we decided not to cover it in the Uruguay round anti-dumping agreement because the US would have walked out. Everybody knows that. So for the appellate body to now needle the United States and say, hey, this practice is irrational. It is irrational, by the way. That's not the point. The point I'm making is that in the WTO, like a country, you have different branches. The members create law. The appellate body interprets law. That's what they're supposed to do. But in a couple of cases, I'm afraid the appellate body has gone. I mean, we said that in the shrimps turtle case. You remember that famous shrimps turtle case in which we were told that we cannot export shrimp to the United States because we happen to kill a few turtles. And we had to tell them that, listen, fishermen are getting killed if they don't expect, or dying if they don't export shrimp to the United States. So that kind of an issue. So the logic is very clear. The US objections to the appellate body, I think, are actually a point of view that is rational. And that is why I think, and Shakti, I take your point that India has not much in common with Brazil and EU in agriculture, but I just wanted to tell you that dispute settlement negotiations were done by India, Brazil, and the EU on the one hand, and United States on the other. One of the things that was guaranteed to us when we accepted the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO is that Special 301 will become a thing of the past. It'll interest you to know, and it's in my book, that the entire final act of the Uruguay round negotiations was done with the title MTO. It was not WTO. It was called the Multilateral Trade Organization. Last minute, Patrick Moynihan of US calls Andy Stoller, my good friend, DDG WTO, tells him, you use the word multilateral, this is never going to get past the US Senate and the Congress. So we destroyed all the front pages of the bloody document and then made it WTO. Because the US said we are not going to give up our ability to take unilateral action. It's as simple as that. But you must realize that after the entry into force of the WTO, this is probably the third time that they're using Section 301. They use the Section 301 as a threat, but to be taking action, this is really the second or the third time. If they do it against China, this will be a new thing. And so China is right in saying that Section 301 action will not hold up in the court of law in WTO. But that is why they very cleverly, the US has done three things. One, they have said some of the Section 301 falls outside the ambit of WTO. They do not want the WTO dispute settlement mechanism to look at it. But the one which deals with intellectual property rights, they've actually come to the WTO and said this is within the WTO, please judge it in our favor. So I think they've been clever about it. There was a panel judgment which said Section 301 is not inconsistent with WTO law in 1997. It never went to the level of the appellate body. Using an expression like not inconsistent is very typical in WTO. You're not saying it's fully consistent, but you're saying it is not inconsistent, double negative. So that's what they have said with regard to. So I think there is a case. I think somebody should talk to the US, really. The US has legitimate concerns on dispute settlement mechanism. That's my feeling. We should talk to them, and nobody's talking to them. That's the problem. And I think EU, India, Brazil would be a good... this is just on dispute settlement. I'm not saying on agriculture or other negotiations. Just on the systemic interest to kind of say that, listen, you are destroying an institution that you built. I think this could work, I think. Friend from Moody's. Yeah, look, maybe the choice of regime change was wrong, so I beg to be forgiven. But what I mean to say is, it is one thing to say that there is a movement in the West which is in terms of a backlash against globalization. You can say that. But I do not share your view that everybody will go around bringing institutions to paralysis. For that reason, I don't think Germany is doing it. I don't think France wants to do it. I don't think UK wants to do it. So there I think you have a difference. You literally have a leader of the free world, Mr. Donald Trump, who believes that the multilateral institutions have not served US interest, and therefore he's opting for a bilateral route. I don't think you are seeing any other Western leader do that. Backlash against globalization is another matter. And that is a different issue. And if you want to know how India will handle it, I think for India it is a challenge. Because more than any other country, I think we need markets to be open. So we will do what we can with the limited ability that we possess at this stage, vis-a-vis other countries to do it. But I do not share your view that everybody else, and I don't think every other leader, even democratic leader, left of center, will say the kind of things he has said about NATO, about UN, and John Bolton is now going to be so God help everybody. So, and then you have, of course, his views on WTO. So I think you are looking at a rare leader who prefers the bilateral route to the multilateral route, to put it mildly. Thank you.
Dinner time, so we should end. I wanted to thank all the panelists. The Katz has posed three questions to them. What is the future of WTO, and how can it be reformed to address the current and future realities? And the general sense I got from the panelists was that don't write off multilateralism. It isn't quite as dead as it some people are making it out to be, but that to make it work, it is probably going to need a type of coalition of people who have a strong interest in it. What I somewhat jokingly call containment of the United States policy. But that is certainly possible. Now, I would just like to add a little bit, slightly longer perspective. I think the world is going through a profound power shift. And unless multilateral institutions start reflecting that power shift, they will be dead. This is as simple as that. You cannot expect to have a system where the old powers continue to run the system when there are new powers who are coming up and have come up and are going to be there. So I'd say that the challenge today is to see how we can get a de facto transition from the post-war system to something which is more reflective of today's world. And you have absurd situations like the board structure of the World Bank, for instance. Look at the IMF, it's become an irrelevant institution. And now why? Because basically Asian countries have essentially opted out of the IMF. They have basically opted out of the IMF for all practical purposes now, you see. So I'd say that the future is WTO is one important dimension of WTO, which has been extensively discussed here, is that it's our first experiment at a law-based multilateralism, where we have rule of law, which has to be then implemented through a judicial process. Now, he did talk about it, reminded me of our Supreme Court, which also has a habit of making law, and which also has a habit of making rather lengthy judgments. But this will happen in any system where you're trying to do a rule of law-based activity, where the law cannot anticipate every situation. So you will have to create a dispute settlement mechanism which has credibility in the eyes of the litigants, of the people who are there. A problem not very different from what we are facing now in India. The credibility of the adjudication system. So we should look also into that. And it's not just whether they are making, they will always make some law. Is there a strong case for developing countries to get together? Yes, I think in a sense you made the case, but I think it'll have to be elastic in the sense it can't be just the big players. You will have to recognize the fact that if you want multilateralism to work, it must also reflect the interests, what I call the SMEs, the small and medium economies. It cannot be something which is simply reflective of the interests of those who are already wealthy, already powerful, already rich. In a sense, what you need is, in the institutional frame, something which is the equivalent of Schumpeterian creative destruction. As Schumpeter told us, in terms of technology and that development doesn't progress unless you have creative destruction, unless those who are established are in some ways are forced to give way to the new entrants. We've seen this in our own corporate structures also happening over the past many decades. What role can an aspiring democracy, why aspiring democracy? I thought we were already a democracy. But what role can a country like India play? The message I get from everybody here is you do not play a role by staying out. The basic message is you cannot play a role by staying out. That you have to be there at the table, regardless of whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea. Exactly. If you think it's a bad idea, go there and say it's a bad idea. Argue it out, campaign it. And I can assure you our diplomats are excellent at putting in language which will ensure that it won't hurt us.
They're doing that in ourselves.
So they are very good at it. They are very good at it. So don't stay out. And TRIPS has been given as an example. It was a profound mistake which was perpetrated then, and we are still paying the price for it now. But that's a different story. Let me just conclude by once again congratulating Pradeep on the excellent work that he has done over all these years in putting this issue before the public, before the government, perhaps playing a certain role in changing the mindset here also. He started his public policy work out